Yes, thanks. I'm going to start out, and then Anne-Marie will be coming in a few minutes. So I'm going to talk about those dense texts that Jonathan just mentioned. As he argued, reading is an important part of learning science, and so how can we help teachers work with a dense and complex text? How can we help them read with students in ways that engage students in thinking about the concepts by looking at the language and how the author has presented the concepts? So the theory that I draw on for this work comes out of linguistics, out of the theory of systemic functional linguistics, which is a kind of linguistics not so well known in the United States, but well known in other parts of the world, that has a kind of grammar that lets us connect language form with meaning. And so by using this functional grammar, we've been working with teachers to help them talk about how texts are constructed and how sentences are constructed, and read with students in ways that help them see how meaning develops over a text and how they can explore a complicated or challenging sentence in a text as a way of learning the concepts. One way that science texts vary, as Jonathan mentioned, is in the genres that students engage with in learning science. Genre has to do with the social purpose of the text, and I've listed here just a few of the genres that students might encounter that also don't always occur as distinct texts, but that are patterns of language that we might see in a text. So a textbook, for example, would have all of these patterns of language in it, and so do many of the smaller texts within a textbook. So students read descriptions, what is Earth made of? They read and write explanations, how does electricity work, for example. They read recounts, retellings from history of scientists and who invented the light bulb. They write about what they have done in a procedure. They have to read and write arguments, and people have talked quite a lot about that this morning. The way an argument is written in science is different from the way an argument is written in language arts. So what kind of evidence is used? How do you link your evidence back to your claim? This is something the science teacher has to work with. So one thing teachers can learn about is the patterns of language that they can recognize as describing, explaining, retelling, or arguing. I'm going to illustrate this today just by focusing on an explanation and what some key language features are in an explanation that teachers could become aware of, and some strategies they can use then to engage students in reading explanations to learn the science concepts. So I'm going to talk about all of these different language features very quickly, and then Anne-Marie is going to illustrate a little bit the ways we've been working with teachers. So here's an example of a text that has a lot of technicality. Of course, teachers are very aware of this, and that's why vocabulary tends to be talked about a lot when we talk about helping teachers work with literacy and science. Of course, vocabulary can't be taught as a list of words. Students have to learn word meaning by seeing the relationships those words engage in texts, spoken texts or written texts. And so there's no point in teaching words before students engage with text as a way of coming to understand what those words mean. So here I've highlighted the key technical terms in this, and you see how they get repeated as the sentences move on, and that's the way students will come to understand what these technical terms mean, is by working with the teacher to see how the meaning shifts now as those words engage in different relationships as the text develops. But beyond that, students can also learn some strategies for recognizing how technical words are defined in texts. So we think of definitions as being constructed mainly in what we could call being processes or having processes, where we see verbs that are be verbs or have verbs. So where a teacher sees a lot of these kinds of verbs in a text, the teacher can recognize we're dealing with a lot of definitions here, let's stop and help the students see how these definitions are constructed and presented. For example, here we see that we have the word or used to introduce a definition. So each has its own properties or characteristics. That's introducing a definition. Students can be shown that. That's a very valuable literacy tool for them then, to understand that this is a different kind of or than they typically encounter in everyday language. This is an or that defines. We see the words is called quite frequently as a way of defining, pointing out that this is a definition. We see statements here highlighted that give conditions under which something can be called something else. So these are all ways authors build definitions into texts that teachers and students can be made aware of. They can have discussion about this, identify the words being defined. Here's where the vocabulary is taught, is in the context of the text and not outside the text. So we've just looked at a part of the explanation text that defines, but in this part of the explanation text now, we're seeing an explanation of how the electric current provides energy that makes things run. Here we're not seeing be and have. We're seeing verbs that are really about doing, because what's going on here is an explanation of what does what in order to make that energy make things run. So here, as teachers recognize, we've moved into a part of the text where we see a lot of doing. We can think about what is doing what here, and what is it doing it to. We use a functional grammar term process to talk about these verbs, because that helps us focus on the meaning and not use terms from language arts that are just about naming forms, so that students can identify what are the doing processes here, and we can identify processes and the participants in the processes. So Anne-Marie will show in a few minutes how our teachers are using these words process and participant in order to get at the key phrases here that are showing the doing and what's involved in the doing. So in this sentence, we can ask, what's the process here? And we see that the process is converted, not just one word, but that phrase is converted is the process of that sentence. And the participant that is converted is the energy of the electrons. Again, not just a single word. The electrons are not being converted. It's the energy of the electrons. So we focus students on reading in meaningful chunks and seeing how the processes and participants together make this meaning and context that helps them understand what's going on in the explanation. So there's a few other things about explanations that teachers can learn and find valuable in talking with students. For example, in many explanations, the way the language works is that something gets introduced at the end of one sentence, and then that gets picked up again at the beginning of the next sentence so that more can be said about it. And then that gets picked up again, and more is said about that. That is how an explanation evolves. And teachers and students can learn to identify what is being picked up now as we move from sentence to sentence, or more technically, clause to clause. But teachers don't need a lot of technical meta-language in order to do this kind of talking once they understand the sort of principles in the way the language builds explanation text. Teachers can also learn something about the connecting words, the conjunctions that are typically found in science texts, and something about their meaning. In this case, the word as, used to show that the two processes, the as is connecting, are happening simultaneously. So students and teachers can learn to look for those connecting words and then explore what is it connecting and what does that mean. We also often present science text as very impersonal and detached, but actually there's quite a lot of author perspective in science texts if you know where to look for it. So you can look at how sure scientists' conclusions and predictions are, how certain they are. They use language that indicates likelihood and certainty, and students can think about the claims that way. They can identify words that present attitudes and connecting words thereto. So I'm going to stop here with this summary on the slide of the language and turn it over to Anne-Marie.
We're very aware of the fact that we stand between you and lunch, so we're going to move along with great alacrity. As Mary mentioned, we've been working with teachers to determine ways in which children can be introduced to these patterns in text as well. And our goal has been to help teachers to support students to learn how to focus on authors' language choices. And we're only going to be able to demonstrate a very tiny sliver of this work, but the curriculum, which we refer to as functional grammar analysis, includes a lot of interactive reading and discussion of text, but also some very simple first-hand investigations. It's important to understand that this work is being done in the context of English language arts instruction. This is not being done in science instruction. Most of the students with whom we're working would actually not have any science instruction were it not for these kinds of opportunities. Our teachers also do demonstrations of phenomena, and they support students to engage in writing about phenomena so that there are multiple activities in which the youngsters are practicing the language. The participants in our design-based research are 26 teachers and a number of coaches. We're working in a school district that serves a very high number of youngsters who speak English as a second language. They are native speakers of Arabic. And they are also coming from communities where the children are qualify for free and reduced cost lunch. So the issue of access to resources is one that our teachers deal with. Mary has already mentioned the role that systemic functional linguistics is playing, but in fact supporting our work are research that's been done understanding the linguistic foundations of reading, sociocultural theory about how important if children are going to learn, these are the points that Sarah and Kathy have been making earlier and others, the importance of interpersonal conversation, discussion, activity. And we know that a very powerful context in which teachers learn new practices is as they're engaging in teaching. So that's prominent in our work as well. The text that Mary has introduced you to is a text that we used at the 4th grade level. And we think that importantly, for each of these texts, there's a content goal, which is very prominent in the conversations. There's some driving question about why we're learning from this text. And there are concomitant goals that have to do with learning something about the functional grammar, the patterns to which Mary was introducing us. I'm going to take a moment to introduce a bit of excerpt of a teacher having an exchange with youngsters from this particular text. It's really about the invention of the battery. This is a pseudonym, Ms. Youssef, and her 4th graders. So you'll see some of the ways in which the teacher is using the language that we've been talking about. So the students read, the acid allowed the electrons in the metals to travel even more freely. The teacher asks, what are the participants? What is doing the work? What's involved? This definitely looks like an IRE sequence. We'd like to suggest, or perhaps in this audience, argue that this might be an appropriate context in which this kind of exchange is not inappropriate. The youngsters identify acid, electrons, what else, the metal. What is the process here? Let's read. The acid's doing what? So the children are now thinking about these 3 participants and what is being enabled by that. The electrons, they're traveling more freely, creating the electric current. And then you'll notice, though, that there are some other features in her exchange, and we're going to, for the sake of time, I'm going to summarize those by pointing out the way that she focuses the youngsters' attention on the key language features, but it's always in the service of constructing an explanation for how the electricity works. She's also drawing on a number of other strategies. So Jonathan, we're very we're also mindful of the ways in which teachers, particularly in the English language arts, have a broad repertoire of strategies. But her focus is really on the coherent interpretation of that piece of the text. This is just to mention that in each case we're looking at measures of student learning, both as measured by the content and also looking at writing samples to find ways in which the youngsters are beginning to appropriate some of the features of the meta-language to which they've been introduced. So we see, for example, not just an increase in the productivity in children's writing as a consequence of these kinds of experiences, but they also begin to introduce connectors in their writing and author attitude. And I'm getting the sign, so we'll stop there.
As you can see, the next speaker is Catherine.
Okay, and I am very aware that we're all going to be starving by the time I finish this, so I'm going to go pretty quickly. The title is, Were It Not for Complex Constructions in Science Texts? And this is based on some work I've been doing with Chuck and Lily Fillmore, grappling with counterfactual conditionals and covert comparatives. But I want to tell you, my punchline is not that teachers need to know this grammatical terminology. It's explicitly that no one needs to use this grammatical terminology, okay? Okay, so the practice 8, one of the facets of it that I thought was really interesting is moving beyond the science textbook and looking at some of these other kinds of sources to bring language into the classroom. So for this presentation, I've looked at pieces from a lot of different sources, including some traditional journals, but also the popular magazines that are available, including Defenders Magazine from the Defenders of Wildlife, okay? And I'm going to give you an example of the kind of thing you find in these. So I've rewritten the article and to really sort of capture what's the story here for this one about koalas.